Okay, so let's get started. Um, Yesterday we started the new parak and we saw the Mishnah. The Mishnah had told us that Mishnah had discussed two topics. The first topic. Okay, so let's get started. Sorry about that. Yesterday we started the new parak and we saw the Mishnah. The Mishnah had told us that Mishnah. Okay, so the first topic was that if a person is in the middle of Torah reading, like he's just in the middle of studying Torah, and he happens to come across the paragraphs of Shema, as long as he has kavana, he's going to be yotze. So, and the second topic, which we're not going to be discussing yet in the Gemara, we'll get to that shortly, is the topic of when and under what circumstances may I interrupt my Kriya Shema with greeting or responding to a greeting of another person. Okay, so we just saw one line from the Gemara yesterday. We're on Yud Ches Amid Aleph. So Amar Rabbi Ba Zos Omeres Shein Habrachos Ma'akvos. One of the things that we can infer from this Mishnah is that you don't need to recite the blessings of Kriya Shema in order to be Yotzei the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. Now, as I'm noting from some of the commentaries on the bottom, this statement seems to be a statement of the obvious, because this is generally true. Anytime I'm doing a mitzvah, even though I didn't make a bracha, the mitzvah is still fine. I've still fulfilled the mitzvah, right? What other mitzvah can you think of that if you don't make the bracha, you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah? Why would I ever think that? Like lighting Hanukkah candles. If I light the Hanukkah candles and I didn't make the bracha, is anyone going to say, I've got to go relight them and make a bracha? No, this is a general principle that Birkas HaMitzvah Eino Ma'akev, that if I do a mitzvah without making the bracha, I have fulfilled the mitzvah. So why would I think that Kriya Shema should be any different? So the commentaries discuss this issue, like, what is he really telling me? Some wants to suggest that this whole sugya is of the opinion that the mitzvah of Kriya Shema is not a biblical commandment, but it's rather a rabbinic commandment. And noting that the whole mitzvah is recital, is not like doing an action like lighting a menorah or or shaking a lulav or something like that, but it's actually recital. Maybe the way that the rabbis required me to do this recital would be under certain other recital protocols. So therefore, if they obligate me to recite the Shema, maybe they would have obligated me to recite the Shema with blessing. So that's really what Rebbe Ba is coming to infer from the Mishnah, that you see clearly from here that you don't have to make the brachos, because the Mishnah doesn't make a point of that. The Mishnah just says, like, if you're just, going along your way, going through Chumash, and you come across Shema and you read it with kavanah to be Yotzei the mitzvah, you don't have to do any more. So Amar Rabbi Yosa, Rabbi Yosa's response to that is, Im Omar at shehu tzarech levarech. He says, Rabbi Yosa adds to this idea. He says, if you're going to suggest that you do need to make the brachos, so beirech tzorich sheyechavein libo b'chulan. So therefore, and therefore, if you're going to suggest that when our Mishnah says that as long as you're reading Chumash, you're learning Chumash, if you had kavanah to be Yotzei, you're going to be Yotzei, you would have to understand that implicit in the Mishnah is that you also beirech, is that you also add in, like you get up to the portion in Parshas Va'eschanan in Devarim, the paragraph of Shema. So you say, oh, I have an opportunity to be Yotzei Kriya Shema. So maybe what you'll say is, when the Mishnah says you're Yotzei, it means, let me now say the blessings of Shema, and then I'll read this paragraph of Shema. That would be a very contrived reading of the Mishnah, but theoretically, maybe that's the way you'd have to read it if you held that the blessings were necessary. So if that's the case, tzorich shiachavein es libo b'chulan. It would then follow from there that you would have to have kavana to be yotze the mitzvah for consistently all three paragraphs. In other words, if you look at the commentary or like what the Art Scroll says, you would have to have kavana b'chulan b'chol parshios shema v'lo dai b'chavana b'parsha harishana bilvad, and having kavana to be yotze in just the first paragraph would not be sufficient. She'im amiras habrachos ma'akeves es hamitzvah. The argument goes like this: if you're going to argue that saying the brachos of Kriya Shema is absolutely necessary, kol shekain shekriya shloshes aparshios me'akeves, then logically the argument is then certainly the actual recital of the three paragraphs of Shema would require kavana. She'eno yotze yedei mitzvahs Kriya Shema kitikuna midirabanan im lo kara eshloshtan, that you would have to read all three paragraphs. You'd have to have kavana. V'keven shekain tzarech lechavin latzes yedei hamitzvah b'chol shaloshes haparshios. If so, you would have to have kavana for all three paragraphs of Shema, thinking about it with with intent. I have in mind to be yotzei the mitzvah. The way that the argument goes, and he brings that this is the way the Pnei Moshe commentary understands this Gemara, is if the rabbis were prepared to require you to make the brachos in order to be yotzei the mitzvah, then certainly they would require you to have kavana for all three paragraphs. It wouldn't be sufficient for you to just think about the mitzvah for the first paragraph. If they're going to be sticklers on the brachos, then certainly they're going to be sticklers on having to have kavana. That's the logical argument. I'm not sure why this logical argument holds. I don't see it as a logical progression that just because they require you to say the brachos, they also require you to have kavana for all three paragraphs. But it seems that the argument basically is if the brachos really are only ancillary to the actual recital of the Shema. If they're such sticklers about the brachos, then logic dictates that they would be sticklers about how you recite the actual Shema itself. And therefore, you would have to have kavana for all three paragraphs of Shema. That's the argument. Yeah.
So typically when you do a bracha, it's almost like the introduction to the act, right?
Right.
And so here, what they're saying sounds like that bracha that they want you to say before is the introduction to the act of reading Kriyat Shema, which is basically whenever you do the act, you should have kavana as well, or not. It's not that.
Well, that's an interesting point. The purpose of a bracha normally is to focus your attention that you're about to do a mitzvah. And maybe that's the connection between the two. If they're requiring me to say the brachos, the two blessings of Yotzer Hamaoros and Ahava Rabbah, before I recite Kriya Shema, logic only dictates that they want me to be focused and aware of all three paragraphs of Shema. The problem with all of this discussion is, and this is not something that I have an answer for, there are different kinds of brachas. There's what's called the Birkas HaMitzvah, a bracha that you make before you do a mitzvah. And that bracha is Asher Kiddishanu b'mitzvasav b'tzivanu al. Yeah, God, you commanded us in your commandments, and you commanded us to do this, or al netilas lulav, let's say, on shaking the lulav or on taking the lulav. Okay, and then immediately afterwards, I do the act of netilas lulav. I take the lulav. The blessings of Kriya Shema does not have that format. Asher kiddishanu b'mitzvasav v'tzivanu likro Kriya Shema, right? Or al mikra Kriya Shema. That's not the brachas that we're making there, and so on the one hand, it is easier to understand why one would think that these brachos are more important than a Birkas HaMitzvah. But on the other hand, because they're not really designed to focus my attention on the mitzvah itself, it's a little bit harder for me to make that connection between the recital of the bracha and having kavana. But nonetheless, it seems that that's what the Gemara is doing here. The Gemara is saying if the rabbis were such sticklers on making sure you made the brachas, it must be because they're really concerned that you should stay focused on the events, on the action at hand that you're about to do, which is to recite the Shema. And that seems to be somewhat problematic, or it seems to be suggesting something that we had never said before. We're going to see later on how much kavana do I have to have? And it seems that later on we're going to see that the most kavana that you have to have is only for the first paragraph of the Shema.
Rabbi, this idea about kavana, I mean, isn't it just a given that you should always have it? Like, it's not all of a sudden we're talking about it here, but every time we do a mitzvah, every
You should always have kavana. The question is failure to have kavana, does that cause the failure of the mitzvah? Does that cause you to not be yotzei the mitzvah? That's what we're discussing over here. Okay. So basically, so Rebbe Ba is of the opinion that the fact that the Mishnah says that you could just be incidentally reading a chumash and be yotzei kriya shema proves that you don't have to say the brachos. Rebbe Yossi says, I have a different proof, because from the Mishnah itself, maybe you would argue that the Mishnah also requires you to say the brachos, but it doesn't say that. The problem, however, is that if you're going to have to say the brachos in order to fulfill the mitzvah, logic would dictate that you'd also have kavanah for all three paragraphs of the Shema. So now the Gemara continues in this discussion, and it says, Hativon. We're going to ask another question on Rebbe Ba, and that is, do you think that, your Rebbe Ba, your argument was the Mishnah never says anything about reciting the brachos, and therefore that indicates that the brachos are not necessary. But ve'eno mafsik. But what about, there are other things that the Mishnah doesn't suggest. We know, we know not from anything that we've learned up until now, but from what we will learn in the future, is that if you're in the middle of reciting Kriya Shema, you're not allowed to have big gaps of interruption in the middle. You're not allowed to, let's say, recite the first paragraph and then go off and have a coffee and start schmoozing with your friend and come back 10 minutes later and commence reciting the other paragraphs of Shema. But, so that's the term ve'eno mafsik. You're not allowed to interrupt. So let's think about this for a second. I'm in the middle of learning Chumash. Where is the first paragraph of Shema? It's in Parshas Va'eschanan. Where's the second paragraph of Shema? It's in Parshas Eikev, like a few columns later. Where's the third paragraph of Shema? Well, you should know that if you've started learning the weekly Torah portion, the Parshas HaShavua. This Shabbos, we're going to read the Parsha of Tzitzis. It's at the very end of Parsha Shlach. So if you're telling me that it's possible for me to be Yotzei Kriya Shema by just reading through the Chumash, so the Mishnah doesn't say anything about skipping, from one paragraph to the next. It just says you're in the middle of reciting the paragraphs. So the Mishnah is not comprehensive in the information that it's providing me. Velo tinisia, velo tini nasa, and the Mishnah doesn't say that. The Mishnah doesn't say that you can only be yotzei provided that after reciting the first paragraph of Shema in Parshas Va'eschanan, you immediately skip to Parshas Eikev for V'haya im Shemoah, and then afterwards you skip backwards several pages to Vayomer Hashem el Moshe Lemor and the Parsha of Tzitzis. Af al gav delo tini nasa. Sorry, v'hacha af al gav delo tini nasa sarich levarech. So therefore, logic dictates that just like the Mishnah doesn't make a point of telling me that I've got to skip from one paragraph to the next to avoid the problem of hefsek, avoid the problem of interruption, so too, maybe the Mishnah does hold that I have to make the brachos of Kriya Shema, but it just doesn't have that information. So that's the question that we're asking on Rebbe Ba. And therefore, as a matter of argumentation, the Gemara over here at this point is suggesting that maybe you do need to make the blessings of Kriya Shema before and after in order to be Yotzei the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. And it's just not something that the Mishnah is talking about. Even though the Mishnah is talking about a person who just happens to be reading Chumash, it could be that when he gets up to the Parsha of Shema, like we said before, he has to stop, recite the blessings, and then launch into the first paragraph of Shema. So that's the argument that the Gemara is making here. So the Gemara then says, Zos Omeres. So once you're going to tell me that the brachos are ma'akev, if you're using that approach, tzarech lechavein es libo b'chulan, that logic would also dictate, like we said before, that you have to have kavana with all three paragraphs. And like he says in footnote number 7, kolomar hagemara mistapekes legabe svaraso shel Rebbe Yosa. Shein habrachos ma'akvos behechrach shetzarech lechavim b'chol parshios ha'im chidush ze nachon o lo. The Gemara is really asking this as a question. Is that correct? Is it a logical connection that is appropriate to make? That once I tell you that you must recite the brachos in order to be yotzei the mitzvah, you must also have kavana for all three paragraphs. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. And we're now on page Yud Ches Amud Beis. Nishmei, it's great to be able to turn the pages so quickly, isn't it? So, Nishmeina min hada. We could learn from the following brisa that you don't have to have kavana for all three paragraphs of Shema, because the brisa says, Rabbi Achai, Amar Mishum Rabbi Yehuda, im kivein libo beperik rishon, afal pi shelo kivein libo beperik sheni, yatsa. That if, as long as you had kavana to do the mitzvah in the first paragraph, even though you didn't have kavana in paragraph number 2, you're still going to be yotzei the mitzvah. So therefore, the Gemara is suggesting that really nothing is conclusive. It's non-conclusive as to whether or not the brachos are necessary. And even if you were to argue that the brachos are necessary, you cannot necessarily infer from there that you have to have kavana with all three paragraphs. And if anything, we have a brisa that states explicitly that you don't have to have kavana. It's the kavana isn't absolutely necessary in order to be yotzei the mitzvah. You only have to have kavana in the first paragraph of the ahavta, and you don't have to have kavana necessarily in the other 2 paragraphs. So the Gemara, yes, hello?
So did we not learn earlier that if, let's say, you realize you haven't had kavana, we shouldn't go back and repeat? Because that would imply, like, if not having kavana means you didn't fulfill the mitzvah, then you want to fulfill the mitzvah, so then you should go and repeat. So doesn't that not having to repeat mean that you're still yotzei, even if you didn't have kavana?
Right. So, Steve, I think you're referring to Shemona Esrei. We talked about kavana in terms of Shemona Esrei.
Okay, sorry.
So that's okay. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, when we looked up the halacha, we learned that originally the Shulchan Aruch had paskined that kavana in the first blessing of the Amida is absolutely necessary, such that if you didn't have kavana in the first paragraph of the Amidah, you have to go back and start Shemona Esrei all over again. And by the way, there, the word kavana may mean something different from the kavana that we're talking about over here. There's 2 types of kavana. There's at least 2 types of kavana. Let me just put it that way. There's one kavana to be yotzei the mitzvah. What's another type of kavana? Perush hamilim. Yeah, to just be able to know what you're saying. So there, when we were talking about the Amidah, because the words themselves are descriptive of the mitzvah that I'm doing, which is to pay homage and to bless Hashem, there it was necessary, the Shulchan Aruch said, to know exactly what I'm saying as I'm saying the words. And if I don't, I'm not Yotzei the mitzvah. So that's actually the halacha over there. But then the Ramah qualified that and said, we are so feeble-minded today and so easily distracted. We all have ADHD of some kind. So therefore, if you fail to have kavana in the first bracha, we do not tell you to go back and start Shmona Esrei again, because who's to say that you'll have kavana the second time, or the third time, or the 27th time? And therefore, just keep on going. It's like you're a lost cause. It's essentially what the Ramah says. And so just keep on going. But of course, as Ron was saying, lechatchila, you always have to have kavana. In every single word and in every single mitzvah, whether it's Shema, the Amida, you have to be mentally engaged. You have to be mindful of what you're doing. The question is, to what extent does that mindfulness is that absolutely necessary, such that if I wasn't, then I'm not Yotzei the mitzvah. So here, what the Gemara is establishing is that we have a brisa that says that if you had kavana to be Yotzei the mitzvah in the first paragraph of Shema, but then got distracted and just started Zangayim Shema Tishmo Mitzvosai, and you're not really thinking, you're not thinking about the words, you're not thinking about the mitzvah, you're just keeping on going by rote, you still have been Yotzei. Okay. Now, the question the Gemara then asks is, Ma bein perek rishon, ma bein perek sheni. But that leads to the next logical question. Why should that be? Why is there an inherent difference between the first paragraph and the second paragraph of Shema? Why is it that the first paragraph is deemed to be more vital for you to have kavana than the second paragraph? It's a good question. I assume that the third is implicit, that like once I get clarity on the second, I'll get clarity on the third too. That's the way I'm understanding the discussion. So the Gemara answers, Amar Rebbe Chanina, Kol ma shekasuv bazeh, kasuv bazeh. So this answer may not satisfy you, Mark, based on what you just asked. So the Gemara answers, because pretty much thematically, everything that's in the second paragraph is already covered by the first paragraph. So as the footnote says, Ikarei hadvarim haksuvim b'parsha harishona v'ahavta v'shinanta mukshartam ksuvim gam b'shniya. If you look at the major ideas, which is to love Hashem, which is also mentioned in the second paragraph of the Hayim Shema, li'ahavas Hashem elokeichem u'la'avdo b'chol avavchem u'b'chol nafshechem, and also v'shinantam, teach it to your children, ukshartam al mezuzos beisecha u'visharecha, or tefillin and mezuzah are both referenced in the first paragraph and in the second paragraph of Shema. And therefore, the Gemara's argument is, as long as you've had kavanah in the first paragraph, you don't need necessarily to have kavanah in the second paragraph. Now, what does that say about the third paragraph? Third paragraph does not have the same thematic ideas as in the first two paragraphs. Maybe the Gemara will get to that later. I don't know. So the Gemara now says, Me'ata lo yikra ela echad. Well, if that's the case, then why do you have to read the second paragraph at all? If it's just a repeat, why do it at all? Why not just be Yotzei the mitzvah with the first paragraph of Shema? So the Gemara answers, Amar Rebbe Ila harishon liyachid v'hasheni litzibor. So the first answer the Gemara gives is because when you look carefully, there's a fundamental difference between the first and second paragraphs of Shema. The first paragraph is written in the singular, and the second paragraph is written in the plural. Because it says, B'chol levavchem uv'chol nafshechem is the second paragraph. Levavchem is in your hearts and your souls. And the first paragraph is B'chol levavecha uv'chol nafshecha uv'chol me'odecha, with all your heart in the singular, with all your soul and with all your might. So that's the first difference. And the Chachamim felt that in order to properly be Yotzei this mitzvah, you need to both discuss my obligations as an individual and my obligations as being part of the nation of Israel, as just a cog in the wheel. So they wanted there to be this included in this mitzvah of affirming your acceptance of the yoke of heaven. They wanted, and when you think about it conceptually, it's a really big thing. I have to commit myself to Hashem as an individual Jew, even if there was no one else in the world doing what I'm doing. But I also need to commit myself to Hashem as a Jew, as a member of an entire family or nation or tribe of people. And that's the second paragraph of Shema. Second answer the Gemara gives is Harishon l'Talmud, v'hasheni l'maaseh. That the first paragraph of Shema emphasizes study, and the second paragraph of Shema emphasizes action. So we really need to unpack that a little bit. If you take a look at footnote number 6, he says, Haparsha Harishona Osekes Be'ikr Be'inyan Talmud Torah. The first paragraph really deals more with Torah study, because it says, V'hayu hadivarim ha'ela. These words that I am commanding to you today should be on your heart. V'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam. You shall teach them to your children and discuss them. So, and really, there's no mention in the first paragraph of acting, doing the mitzvot. Okay, all it just says is v'shinantam levanecha v'dibarta bam. However, in the second paragraph in V'hayim Shamoa, it says, Hayim Shamoa Tishmeu El Mitzvosai. If you hearken unto my commandments, Ula Avdo B'chol Levatem, and to serve Hashem with all your heart and with all your soul. So the Ula Avdo really refers to the action of the mitzvos themselves. And so therefore he writes in the footnote, Me'achar Shahaparsha Hashniya Marchivat Inyan HaParsha Rishona, Miyachid Litzibor Umelibad Lamaisa Tzarech LaOmer Gamkein. That's why you need to say the second paragraph of Shema. It adds two features. It adds the feature of switching from the individual's responsibility to the community's responsibility, and it switches from the theoretical or the epistemological or the just the study of Torah, and it transfers to the physical performance of the mitzvot. Umikol makom le'inyan kavana, but as far as having that's necessity to have kavana, dai im mechavin beparsha rishana bilbat. It's sufficient if you only have kavana in the first paragraph. Kevin shekol echad min hatzibur hu yachid b'halimud atzmo mevi besofo shel davar lidei ma'aseh. Since at the end of the day, the first paragraph contains the obligation to study the Torah. Study will bring you to do the mitzvot. And as an individual, once I acknowledge my obligations as an individual, I will eventually join together with other individuals to constitute a nation. So we'll hold it here for today. Interesting concepts that we're learning now about the different paragraphs of Shema. Here's wishing you a great Shabbos.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom, everyone. And we'll see you, Bezrat Hashem.